Hey there, I'm Ryan and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll also have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, this channel is predominantly fan-funded, so if you feel like you're enjoying, you're having fun, you're learning things, do consider checking out the Patreon. We do have a lot of fun things up there on top of the reference photos and traceables, like that of my ebooks, and even a bunch of polls. So, a bunch of fun stuff. Do check it out if you're enjoying. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 9 by 12 inch canvas and a 1 inch flat-headed brush. From there, I'll dip the bottom third into some water, condensing our bristles and ensuring that our paint does stay wet for a longer period of time. With that, on to step number 1. Now, jumping into it, we are going to grab quite a bit of our titanium white, the smallest hint of Mars black, and we'll use the other side of the brush to grab an equally sized bit of ultramarine blue. I did use opposite sides of my brush there, that way we didn't kind of bring one pigment into the other and dilute them kind of too early on. And here we are just mixing it up quite thoroughly, that way we don't have some areas that are a little bit more black, some areas a little bit more blue. We do want it to be nice and consistent. From there though, we are hopping into the actual painting process, and as you can see, the pigment we rendered wasn't all that far off from the white of the canvas, but it is slightly blue. It has a bit of a gray feel to it, so it does add to the atmosphere, right? And that's really what we wanted to do. Though, that said, here for the actual application process, I am being fairly loose going over my previously drawn subjects, at least a lot of the branches. I'm trying to keep the general shapes and the general movements of the pre-existing drawn subjects, but I do want to move over them slightly. That way I can layer the mid-ground subjects and the foreground subjects on top of my background later on, rather than trying to paint them perfectly right beside that subject. It's just going to look significantly more natural and make the process a lot easier as well. I'm also going to go over a lot of these applications a couple of times with that horizontal soft stroke once I'm done applying it. That way everything does look quite consistent. So here I'm applying this with a vertical stroke, but inevitably I am going to move over it with a horizontal stroke and just make it nice and cohesive. We're also going to be speeding up a little bit of the footage where things do get hyper repetitive, but for the most part this will be done in real time. Jumping into step number 2 here, we are going to grab our filbert brush, which is about 1/3 of an inch, and it's quite versatile because it can carry a good amount of paint, but it also has some soft edges, which can be nice for blending. With that, I'm grabbing quite a bit of my golden green, about an equal amount of titanium white, and then just the smallest hint of Mars black. I want to ensure that as I interject this into the mix, I am being fairly careful because it's an extremely strong pigment and it's very easy to make your mix a lot darker than you initially intended it to be. With that, I do just kind of test that on my reference photo. I realize, you know what, it does need to be darker, so I work in some Mars black. Admittedly, I think more than I should, so I add some extra titanium white. We do some course correcting there, and now we're going back to testing. Here, yet again, as I do test against those background trees, I do feel it's still a little bit too dark, so we work in some additional titanium white. Of course, every time we do this, we do kind of take away a bit of that saturation, but I think this is actually perfect for those distant trees in the background and our base layer. So with that, we are jumping into the canvas. Now here, I'm trying to apply this paint with as little pressure as possible. When you press your brush into the canvas, the bristles, they expand and therefore they create a larger stroke, as you can see right here. Though you don't want every area to be a large stroke. Generally, they're going to be smaller portions to your branches and your foliage. So when I'm working in the body of these trees, I'm applying significantly more pressure. Though when I get towards the edges and the kind of spots that leaf off, I relieve pressure. That way I get that smaller application. So here we are moving to a very delicate area of the tree. It doesn't have a lot of foliage. So I was trying to use as little pressure as possible, where in these areas where there is a lot of foliage, I'm definitely pressing significantly harder and getting more paint on the canvas. Here, when I'm closer to the body of the tree, I apply more pressure, and then as I move out towards the sky, I relieve it. We kind of get this nice bell shape, and I am always trying to diversify my applications here. We are working on very organic, very natural subjects, and we want to ensure that they are always different. So when I'm going in to do these details with this tapping effect, I'm trying to ensure that I'm never mirroring each side of the tree. I'm not looking for real duality there. I'm essentially creating a branch through a series of semi-random taps, and then I say, okay, you know what, let's not do the exact same thing on the opposite side. Let's move down a little bit, let's move up a little bit, let's just find a way to change them and keep them continuously interesting, because A, it'll be more captivating, but B, when you are actually out in nature, you'll notice that trees aren't always, exactly the same. So pristine here is actually making things maybe a little bit more messy, which I think can be a very freeing idea and process in painting, and one of the reasons a lot of people really love painting landscapes and scenery. You aren't always fixated on making absolutely everything correct, because sometimes in scenarios like this, it's more of a cathartic process where having things that are a little bit off actually makes them look a whole lot better. With that, I am going to speed up a little bit of this video here because we are process-wise, again, in a bit more of a repetitive spot. It's a lot of tapping. It's trying to get the edges of those branches to continuously get smaller in a different way. And I'm also going to fill out the main bodies of these trees while also creating a couple of different layers. When you're working with acrylic paints, generally you do need to do a couple of layers. You can even tell here that there are some thin spots, and that's because acrylic paints are inherently quite thin. So do try to get that initial application on, let it dry fairly well, go in, do that second layer, and then proceed from there. Though here we are now moving out. Again, I'm avoiding the larger areas of my previously drawn trees for the most part, but still trying to move on top of the edges slightly. That way, eventually, I can layer them and the midground on top of these background applications and not kind of accidentally have some white canvas showing through between the different subjects. That's one of those things that I think we tend to do as beginners, and the longer you paint, the more you kind of recognize how and where to avoid that. So just do continue to try to move over those older applications, and it will look quite nice. Here I'm just continuing to diversify. I'm kind of jumping around in this process, and I'm doing that purposefully so that I don't kind of subconsciously start doing the same thing and rendering something that looks very visually samey. Again, diversity really is the key to making these look really, really fantastic. But with that, I think we are off to a really great start, and I love this base layer. Now that we have our base layer applied, we are going to start mixing a darker color with that same filbert brush. We'll start with a good amount of sap green, almost the same amount of Mars black, and then yet again an equal mixture of the titanium white. This is going to render a mixture that is slightly darker than our initial application. We are going to test that in those background trees again. This time, however, we're not looking for the middle value. We're looking for the darkest color, the darkest value in those distant trees. That is going to act as our shadows. Though I am going to switch to a 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, as you can see right there. It is fairly disheveled. It does have some fairly stiff bristles, and that is important. I'm also not wetting this brush because I don't want the bristles to condense. I do want them to stay fairly far apart and retain their strength. So here, I'm going in with that darker pigment, as you can see, and I'm just tapping this into our base layer. I'm rotating my brush in the air in between each tap. I'm not rotating it once the brush has actually touched the canvas, because then I would render a myriad of streaks, which is not my intention here. I do just want to create a slight pattern, a slight bit of texture and detail in a slightly darker pigment, which we can lend there our highlights on top of, and that way this will essentially look like our shadows, areas where the light just can't work their way in. So while I'm doing this, I am trying to get fairly good coverage, but I'm also not attempting to fully cover that base layer. I do still want that mid value that we painted initially to show through, because if we were to paint all of this with the darker pigment that I'm tapping on here, we wouldn't have any variance and we wouldn't have any contrast. So we would kind of lose the detailed effect that we are looking for. So do try initially to do so fairly sparingly, and then over time you can go back over areas and add more. Just do be careful and ensure that we are still having that other color show through. You can also see that I am continuously going back to that palette, grabbing more paint. The last thing you want to do is kind of continuously have to press harder with your brush into the canvas, because if you do that, you will kind of spread the bristles and create all of those strokes that we don't want to. We are really just tapping the end of the brush, all of the pigment on there, onto the pigment on the canvas, and that is it. Here, yet again, we are speeding things up because it is a fairly elongated process to cover all of this, but again, definitely falls into that kind of cathartic category. Here we are moving towards the right hand side of the canvas. I am not concerned about going over the trees. As you can see, I'm going to be painting those with a different color, and so we're just getting as good a coverage as we can. So while we wait for that layer to dry, we are going to start mixing up a nice highlight for all of our trees. This is going to be the brightest of our pigments, so we'll be using significantly more of the titanium white and significantly less of the Mars Black. Here we are mixing right beside our initial two applications. That way we can see how they all look in relation to one another, make sure that one isn't too saturated or not saturated enough, and also ensure that we are moving the pigment in that kind of correct direction. So here I'm heading over, testing that on to the reference photo right there, and I felt like it could be a little bit darker. So we did grab some additional Mars Black. We go back to that testing process, and it is important to not just go with the first color you get, but I was happy there. So now we're going to switch to the fan brush for the first time. As you can see, it's quite an interesting brush, but it can lead to some fantastic applications. Then I'll grab some of that pigment, and then on an angle, tap on a lot of the little pieces of protruding foliage. Now this, much like the last layer, is something you want to do initially fairly sparingly. We don't want to add so much highlight that we only see highlight. We don't want to completely cover up or remove all of the mid values or the darker values which we've instigated here. This is something that is to work in conjunction with all of those. It is working on top, but not fully. Here you can see that I'm doing a bit of a tap and drag effect. So I'm letting the brush touch the canvas and then I'm dragging it up a little bit. This is a very easy way of creating some visual additional dimension in the painting, right? Because now we can see kind of how the branches are leaning, falling, all of that. Not something you have to do with this, and as you probably noticed, I didn't do it with the tree on the left, but I wanted to show you multiple different ways of going about this. So you can do just a tap, or here, as you can see yet again nice and close up, there is a tap and a little bit of a drag to give us some movement in those branches, though you can also interject that movement in there later on. Here, I'm going back to that tapping effect without the drag and creating a lot of additional detail. Generally, you'll get a lot more detail through the actual tapping than you will the tap and drag. So kind of working them back and forth in conjunction with each other is a good move. But if you only want to do one of them, make it the tapping effect, and then with a liner brush later on, start to connect them. And we'll do that together too, so you will get to see that process. But one thing you don't want to do is simply go in with the tap and drag motion and leave it at that. If you go in with the tap and drag, make sure that you also do just the tapping motion to give it a bit more detail, to give it some additional variety, and really play with it in an interesting way. So with that, here you can see we started kind of more so in the middle of the canvas, and then I worked my way to the left and to the right. That's because the only area we're really going to see is the middle of this. The majority of it is going to be covered, so I did put the extra effort into those spots. And it's also worth noting that, portions of this are still going to be seen through the mid-ground and foreground trees, so you do want to ensure that it's done well, but just recognize that we are going to cover up a lot of it, and that is okay. Sometimes when you want to make your painting great, you do need to kind of reduce detail in some areas and cover up areas that you love, but it is good to put that time in and make it fantastic, just in case that spot does end up showing through. So now we're going to head back to our palette and start mixing up a slightly brighter pigment than what we just worked with. So here I'm grabbing some additional white, turning that into our green, and I am admittedly using the fan brush here. Not optimal. Generally, I do work with the filbert brush for the actual mixing process, and then I'll switch to something like the fan brush or the liner brush. But I did want to show you that it was possible, though again, not optimal. With that, the idea here is to continuously add depth to our trees, and we do that by wrapping light around them. So here we are taking this new brighter color, this pigment that is rendered on our foliage when more light is touching it, on the edges of our trees. In this painting, the light is, for the most part, coming from right between the two trees. So when we look at the trees and the foliage on the left-hand side of the painting, we add our highlights to the right-hand side of them. Then, when we're painting on the right-hand side of the painting, we are adding highlights to the left-hand side of the trees that are on it. That way, the light is wrapping its way around both in a very natural format. Here, you can see really close up how we're going about this. The majority of these applications are done with a tap, though occasionally I am doing a little bit of a drag as well, though I do want the tap to be the more prominent application with this. I'm also going to eventually move this slightly more into the body of the trees, and I'll also use it to separate some of the trees as they do look a little visually samey, a little clustered. So you can use this almost as an outline, though you don't want to actually create an outline. That is something that we try to learn fairly on with painting, that there aren't actual outlines around anything, but rather more light on certain edges. So I'm not trying to fully define an edge. I'm not trying to fully flesh it out and take out all of the shadows that are underneath, but I do want the majority of the edge to have these nice brighter highlights. Here you can see we are moving over to the left and we're kind of building it up on the top. The majority of this will be covered up by other trees later on with completely different values, but again, some of it will show through, and we do want that, well, those little pieces to look quite nice, right? We are giving each and every element, each and every aspect of this painting a lot of care and love, and because of that, we are also now washing our brush. We're going to change to use some different colors, and I don't want things to dry on the brush or kind of get too diluted. So make sure that you're taking care of your brushes and things like that, and they will last you quite a while. So now we are heading back to our palette. We will grab quite a bit of our burnt umber, about an equal mixture of Mars black and a little bit of titanium white as well. We are using the filbert brush for this because, again, it is pretty ideal for the mixing process. And then we're going to try this on our tree trunks. As you can see, that was a pretty good match from the beginning, so I am happy with that. We are going to commit to the canvas, and when I'm doing this, I don't paint my trees with a single elongated application. Instead, I like to apply the brush to the canvas, move down a little bit, create a bit of a stroke, and then I take my brush, I lift it off, and then I go back in and I continuously add more. I try to do this through a series of strokes rather than one elongated one, because generally in nature, trees aren't perfectly straight. They have all of these little visual anomalies which make them much more interesting. It's also worth noting that for the most part, I'm not trying to make my trees stand perfectly straight up. ideally they have a little bit of a lean to them in one direction or the other. You want it to be subtle sometimes. Here, we're not making it so subtle, but again, it's those little variations which are going to make it so much more interesting. It's also worth noting that I am continuously wetting my brush and grabbing more pigment because I don't want my brush to get dry and I don't want to get a chalky look with our applications. I want these trees to look nice and sharp on the edges. I don't want the tooth of the canvas to show through. So we are going over it a number of times. We're using a good amount of paint. We're not kind of dragging what little paint we have on there. And here you can see up close just how thick and, you know, how much care we're putting in to each and every one of these applications. With that, we are going to now head back to our palette and we'll start on another tree, starting on the edge of this tree. Also, this is something I always like to bring up. I generally like to work on the right and left hand side of the tree first, and then I fill in the middle after, because when you first grab paint while your brush is still damp, you have the most opportunity to create the perfect line, to create something that's sharp, to create something that's consistent, to create something that's not going to have that toothy canvas effect. And the longer you use it, the more you kind of have to press in with your brush, the less paint you have. So it becomes harder and harder to create that very sharp line. So I like to start on the left and the right hand side so I can get that very pristine, nice looking application. And then I go into the middle of the tree and it's just kind of like painting it in. So that is generally how I like to advise the process. I also, for the most part, do like to ensure that while I'm going about this, I'm trying to look at the other trees and ensure that they're not all looking exactly the same, that we are diversifying and that we're creating something a little bit different every time. While I'm doing this, I'm also looking over at the reference photo, just trying to take what ideas I can there, but occasionally I do kind of go off and do my own thing because, you know, reference photos, the traceables, they are meant to aid you in the process, they are meant to help you, they are meant to guide you, but they are not meant to handcuff you. They're there to help you enjoy the process more. So if you are, again, a member up over on Patreon, you are working from the reference photo or the traceable as well, do feel like if you have inspiration for another tree, another movement, really anything, do feel like you can incorporate that and make the piece your own. So make sure that you're also having quite a bit of fun with it. But with that, I think we do have a fairly good amount of trees here. They are looking nice and different. Admittedly, the one we were just working on could definitely use another layer, and I will go back and add at least one more layer to all of these. So once we have the main bodies of the trees complete, we are going to switch over to our Conte, which is essentially like a colored chalk, and I'm going to draw in a lot of the little branches here that I do see in that reference photo. They will of course also be drawn in the traceable, but with that, I like to use Conte because you can allocate colors to different subjects. It comes off with water. And speaking of water, we are going to take this new liner brush and make sure that it is nice and damp. The liner brush is a very small brush, and it's fantastic because the very limited number of bristles ensures that you can create very small applications like that for branches, which we are now working in here. I am essentially initially going over all of my drawn on branches and will slowly add them from there. I normally like to, work in a reasonable amount, take a couple of steps back, look over the painting and then say, all right, where do we want more of these? Does it feel balanced? How do we kind of proceed? And then from there, we do so. But right now, I'm essentially just going over all of the initially drawn kind of areas and opportunities. While I do this, I'm also occasionally breaking my own rule. You can see that for a number of these branches, I do use a single stroke and I try to incorporate these little waves and movements. Do recognize that while I am doing that, I think for the majority of your branches and trees, the best way of going about it is still making a little bit of an application, stopping, taking that brush off the canvas, going back to the canvas, continuing that stroke, and doing that a couple of times. That way you get those nice, very natural little breaks. But as you can see, you can kind of render these softer looking branches, and you do have some option there. It is subjective. It comes down to what aesthetic you are personally, more captivated by, more inspired by. So do consider that. I'd also like to note that we're quite close here, and as you can see, not all of these strokes are incredibly full. We are working with acrylics. A lot of the brush here, it is quite wet, so we are getting some semi-transparent applications. We are going to need to go over it a couple of times, and one thing I'm really not doing is pressing harder with my brush in an attempt to get more paint on the canvas so that I don't have to go back and do multiple layers. Here, you really want to ensure that you are applying as little pressure as possible, because the more pressure you apply, the larger your application is going to get, and we really want to work hard to avoid that. I'm also trying to ensure that when I start my branches, I am using slightly more pressure with my brush, and then as I get towards the outskirt of the branch, the area that's supposed to get smaller, I relieve pressure. That way it naturally does just get smaller. So another very simple little tip that you have there to ensure that your branches are quite natural. And here, yet again, quite close. We are going to go over some of these applications a couple of times, and I'm also going to go to the area that connects to the tree, and I'm going to thicken that with a second application. Here you can see that I'm kind of moving it down in almost like a bell shape, and I do think that that's another really good strategy for just ensuring that your branches look like they are growing and progressing quite naturally. Here we're also doing a bit of a crisscross motion in some of these bottom branches. You want to ensure that the branches don't just move left and right and avoid each other, but they are going to intersect. They are going to move around one another. This is meant to be a three-dimensional piece, and it's only natural that your branches do end up going behind in front one another rather than just beside them. So do try to do that and just really have fun with the process. So jumping back into it here, we have our filbert brush, and we're starting with about an equal mixture of Mars Black and our burnt umber. Then we'll also grab a little bit of titanium white, this time looking to render a pigment which is both slightly brighter and slightly more saturated than our last mixture. So as you can see, I did go back and add in some additional burnt umber. This is going to be for our bark, which does protrude from our trees, and how we'll start creating some real dimension on our subjects. With that, you can see that I am just testing it over on our tree, making sure that it does look fairly good. And then I'm grabbing some green actually and mixing up a secondary bark color, because as you can see on our reference photo, not all of the bark does actually look like a brown. There is quite a lot of moss on the tree, but you can also see that some of the individual little pieces of bark are a bit more of a green. So I just wanted to show you that that is another color and option you can work with. That said, here we are working on our actual tree, and I'm doing so with the bark. Despite it matching quite well with the reference photo, I found that I did want it to be brighter. So here with my liner brush, I am working in some additional titanium white and then additional burnt umber as well, because when we mix the titanium white and the burnt umber with the Mars Black, we end up getting more of a gray mixture because of the white and black. So we add in extra brown to kind of retain and get back some of that saturation. Here though, I am now applying individual little pieces of bark. It's done with a tap and a drag effect. Most of it is fairly vertical, but occasionally I will move one piece of bark into the other, kind of creating little pathways and things of that nature, though we do want the darker base layer showing through in little areas to the left, to the right, all of that, because those are the sunken in parts. They are the sides of all of the protruding pieces of bark, and they're quite important for creating the depth and the texture. Much like the background trees with the shadows, you really don't want to cover the entirety of our darker base layer here. Having portions of that show is what's going to render us a lot of contrast and a lot of detail, because just visualize it in your mind for a second. Let's say we painted the entire left-hand side of this tree with this brown highlight. You just wouldn't have much detail, you wouldn't have much texture, you'd essentially just have two different values and not much else. So it's important to do this. Also worth noting that because the light is coming from the center of the painting, here I'm trying to predominantly work these highlights over on the left-hand side of the trees on the right-hand side of our painting. Whenever I say that, I imagine that it's a little bit confusing, but it's always done, or rather said, quite purposefully. So if you do listen, it should make sense. But here I am continuing that general idea. The light is coming from the center, so I'm working the highlights predominantly onto the left-hand side, and then I'm letting them dissipate as I move over to the right-hand side. That way there's a gradual change to a darker value, and that will naturally happen if you start on the left-hand side, because the paint will dissipate. The pigment, again, is semi-transparent, so the more it dissipates, the more you're left with just water on the brush, the more thin your pigment will be. Therefore, the darker underlayer will show through, and you will again just create a very natural base layer through that process. So we like to start when we have more paint on that left-hand side, the side that is closest to the light, and then we work over to the right. And I think it's actually going really, really well here. Again, much like literally every other subject, we are trying to keep a lot of diversity in this. I don't want all of my applications to look exactly the same, so sometimes I'm elongating things a little bit more. Sometimes we are allowing some areas to be a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. We're moving into the left and the right, and just continuously creating something pretty captivating. But because the contrast isn't wildly different, we're not going to get anything that isn't subtle regardless, which is nice. And we will also be applying a lot of foliage on top of this. So regardless of kind of how each individual area turns out, you are going to have an opportunity later on to cover up the areas that you don't necessarily love. So don't worry about it too much. Though if you do render an area that you don't absolutely love, you can just let it dry, remix the darker pigment that we used for the base layer, cover it up, let that dry, and then come back in with the bark. And it's really that simple of a process. Here we are speeding things up because, again, it does take a little bit of time to get through the entirety of this process. And I really didn't want to kind of have to put out like a 5-6 hour lesson. I think that making these relatively digestible is important, and that 2.5 hour range I think is pretty reasonable for a painting with this level of detail, because it certainly is a highly detailed piece. I think with pretty much every subject we're doing multiple layers, adding on different levels of detail, highlights, mid values, different little things for the shadows. So I think that 2.5 hours is probably that sweet spot. Here, though, we are now moving over to the left-hand side of the canvas. So, of course, we are painting the light on the right-hand side of the trees. And as our pigment does start to run out and we just have that water on our brush, then we will start moving over to the left-hand side of these, just kind of creating that very natural gradient of light to dark as that light wraps around the tree, gives it some dimension. And, of course, it has multiple layers of dimension, because not only is the light moving from one side to the other, but we also have this protruding subject, which makes it look more three-dimensional. So it's not kind of a 2D subject with the light that's moving across it, but it's 3D and the light is moving around it, and also getting lost within all of the crevices of our bark. So a lot to do there. You'll also have noticed at this point that I have exclusively worked with our brown mixture, despite the fact that we did mix up a green mixture. The green, I think, looked quite nice. I think that it made sense within the context of the painting. However, I do intend to paint moss in a later stage, which is going to have a lot of green, so I didn't want my colors to kind of get too convoluted. Here, having that brown is quite nice. It just kind of stands out against the green that is behind, that will be in front, and again, it won't mix too much with the moss, which we will render relatively soon. So again, just trying to show you different options. While I'm doing this lesson a specific way, I do want you to feel like throughout this process you're learning how to do a number of different things, and that you can kind of move off in your own direction should you want to, and again, render something that's personal to you, that you very much love and care about. I think that is huge in painting. Even when you're following a lesson, you can deviate and make something your own, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. Though I also do think it's quite beneficial to just kind of follow along, learn as much as you can, and copy as much as you can, because that is a good test of skill, of course, and that way you do ensure that you are kind of broadening your horizons and not necessarily moving away from applications of subjects which you may find a little bit more difficult until you actually do it. So yeah, so far so good. Though we are just kind of finishing up the bottom areas of all of these trees. I'm jumping around so that I don't kind of subconsciously fall into the trap of doing the same thing over and over again, and that's something that we did do in those background trees as well. It's a very common practice for really the whole painting process. So now that we have those really nice kind of mid values for our trees, we're going to start working them onto our branches as well. This is also going to be done with that smaller liner brush. That brush is quite damp, and we are predominantly working these highlights onto the tops of our branches, because the light, while it is coming from the middle of the painting, it's also probably a little bit higher up. So the light is going to be shining down on a lot of these, even when they are moving to the right hand side of the canvas. And with this, one thing you do want to be quite careful of, and I can tell that I've made a couple of mistakes throughout this process, is when you're applying the paint, try to ensure that you are slightly overlapping the top of the dark branch, because otherwise, if you kind of work inside it, you almost have what looks like an outline, a dark outline atop and below the new lighter brown. And again, outlines, it's something we really do want to avoid through the painting process. So if you do kind of feel like you're running into that issue, try painting slightly above that initial branch and then work your way down a little bit. Though we do still want our branches to be really tiny initially, and then if we want, we have the option of making them wider. In general, it's a lot easier to make your subjects wider than it is to make them smaller. So that is a just good general rule for painting pretty much every aspect of trees, and we are definitely continuing with it. So now we're going to start working with an even brighter brown. You can see that I'm grabbing quite a bit of titanium white, some additional burnt umber to re-interject all of that saturation. And now we're going to get really close and start applying some highlights to the areas that we feel are going to be receiving the most amount of light. So we started to create depth through the actual gradient of light to dark. We had a little bit more because of the choice of texture we kind of interjected into that, and now yet again we are building up that depth by adding in an additional highlight, this one much brighter than the actual darker pigment that we started with. So we are slowly building it up. That very much is how acrylics work. It's much of building a foundation and then adding pretty little things until eventually you have this beautiful house, something you can be proud of, right? So that is what we are doing, and I do want this to get a little bit more subtle as we move towards the left and the right hand side of the painting. I want this to be something that is quite special and predominantly saved for the middle, though we will do hints of it as we move to the left and right, just so things do still feel cohesive and some of these trees, they are going to protrude in such a way that they do catch real light. So we don't want it to only exist in that one area. It might look a little cartoony, but we want it to predominantly exist in that singular area. And it really is, again, a really fun process. You'll hear me say that a lot throughout this lesson because I think there are a lot of cathartic areas of this painting, but we're essentially doing a technique that we've already done before, so it's something we are comfortable with, we are refining, we are making things better, and at this point we're probably applying it better than we have before because we've had opportunity to practice, which is just so important. So right here, as you can see quite close, we're working it on the right hand side of these trees because the light is coming from the center, and I'm letting it dissipate as we kind of move more into the center, taking our hand back, giving it a second, giving it a good look, not just applying paint for the sake of applying paint, and really thinking about it, which is definitely something I'd heavily recommend with your pieces as well. So here you can also see that some of these applications are a little bit toothy. While I do have quite a bit of water on my brush, I don't have that much, and that's because I'm okay with having a little bit of that canvas texture in this application, in this layer. You need to think about what your subject is, what texture should be associated with said subject, and here we have a lot of bark, right? Something that I do think has some real grit to it in a lot of situations. So you can actually take advantage of the gritty, toothy canvas, and if you're not using too much water, then you can actually incorporate that and just kind of capture a little bit of extra free detail, which is pretty cool. I'm also taking the opportunity to work on the smaller branches, though for these I am using a lot more water because they're quite small, and if you don't have that water on your brush, you're going to have a harder time creating a smaller stroke. So that is something I'm, kind of going back and forth with, sometimes drying my brush, sometimes making it a little bit more wet. Again, consider the subject you're working on. So once all of that's dry, we can start working with our moss, and that means going back to our green gold. I have some titanium white, a quite small amount of Mars black. You can see we did wipe off the excess there, and now we're blending it all up. The first mixture here is being done with the liner brush, which isn't the most efficient brush because it doesn't, pick up that much paint. But as you can see, we actually found a really beautiful green to start off our moss with. It isn't the brightest color of green, and I think I actually opted for more of the darker variant of it, something we can build highlights on top of. But this is going to be applied in a very similar fashion to our bark, a lot of very small little tap and drag effects, though I'm not going to be working my way around the tree kind of dependent on light in the same way we did with the bark. This is going to be much more sporadic and random, though for the most part it is kind of originating down at the bottom of the tree, and then we work our way up quite progressively. So also leaving little holes, little areas that don't have any of that moss. When you step back, as you can see, things do look quite nice, and I like how subtle it is at this point. We will be building a lot of extra highlight and depth into this, but you want to start with something that looks really natural and quite subtle, actually. So I'm skipping a fairly large portion of this tree, then we kind of find ourselves in the middle. I always love doing that with moss. I think that it makes it look significantly more unexpected and interesting, right? It doesn't just exist at the bottom, but there isn't this perfectly crafted line upwards either. So I am just kind of trying to ensure that I'm being playful and that it all looks quite interesting as well. Though this process does take quite some time, so we are going to speed up a little bit of our footage here. Now I'm hopping over onto the left-hand side of the canvas, essentially just doing more of the same here and really just enjoying the process. So here, the liner brush, yet again, very much coming in handy. We have so many little details in the painting, and this really is the perfect brush to get the job done. Now that we have our base layer for our moss applied, we are going to start working with something a little bit brighter. So mixing beside that initial moss mix, I have my new pigment. It is a bit brighter. We have less of our Mars black. We're going to have slightly more of our golden green, so we have more of a saturation. And we're just going to test that over on the reference photo there. I could tell that I liked it, but I could also tell that it was just a little bit too saturated and maybe slightly too dark as well. So we worked in some additional titanium white, and just like that we found the pigment we wanted. Now with this, I am going to start thinking about where the light is coming from. Yet again, we did kind of look past that for our last layer, but this is meant to be a brighter, showing of the moss. Now, as soon as I started applying it, I realized that while it matched well in the reference photo, I personally wanted something that was a little bit darker to start out with. We could do, a lighter layer a little bit later on, so I added in some extra titanium white, or rather Mars black. Titanium white would brighten it. We definitely added in some extra Mars black. But now I'm going back in and I'm doing some little taps, not covering all of the moss with this application. We are going to be fairly selective, and initially I'm going to approach it with the less is more kind of attitude. I don't want it to become overwhelming. I don't want it to steal the attention away from the rest of the trees, the highlights and the branches. So I'm trying to keep the value to the point where the highlighted bark isn't overshadowed, and that's kind of my marking. That's kind of how I tell if I'm doing too much brightness or too much detail in any one area. But for the most part, I'm kind of, yet again, just dancing around, though I do want to ensure that the sides that are collecting more light have a good showing of this new mid value. So something else to consider through the process here, yet again, just speeding through these little portions. We'll tap it more in the middle of the trees as well, and even up higher. Just a little bit here and there can make such a big difference. And you also want to work partially in clusters, because that can be kind of a great avenue to different patterns which you haven't yet explored. So while we are working a little bit sporadically, especially as we move up, we are still trying to establish these different shapes that have been, kind of possibly neglected in other areas of our trees. This one I think is coming along absolutely wonderfully, though that makes sense because we've now done 3 or 4 trees on the other side, and generally with painting, the more you do, the better you get. We get our practice, we get to kind of learn how much we want to apply, what our technique is going to be, and things just kind of get better as you continue the process. So yeah, nice to see that we are learning, that we are, getting all warmed up. This is definitely something that I've done so many times in the past with, just a litany of paintings. But despite that, as we work through the painting, it does still get better and better. And that is just, you get more comfortable. You learn little techniques that just improve it here and there. And, you also find your preferences as well, because it can be done in so many ways, and finding the way you want it done is so important. Here I go in with a pigment that is just a little bit brighter, still kind of following the idea of where the light is coming from. And I'm also doing a lot of this, as you can see, from a bit more of a distance. I purposefully have the camera farther away from the canvas in this kind of setting, because this is something that could easily be overdone, and it's very easy to overdo it and add too much detail and too much highlight when you're close up, because you're saying, oh, that area looks so fantastic, but when you take a step back you realize it just doesn't fit with the rest of everything else. So by painting it farther back, we can ensure that it does still mesh with the rest of our renderings, and that we do get something nice and cohesive that doesn't kind of go overboard. So that is exactly what we're doing here. We're taking that step back, and I'd recommend you do that every 5 or 6 minutes. It can really have a great impact on the painting. Now we're going to continue with that painting process of moss, and we're going to work on some of our branches here. So much like the highlights to the branches, I'm going to be working on the top. Again, avoiding kind of working it accidentally inside of the branch because we don't want that highlight. So if you need to, go over the top of it just a little bit, though do be careful and don't kind of make the branch significantly wider than it needs to be. We're still working with quite a bit of water. We're still working with a very soft touch. I went in initially with the darker base layer green that we worked on initially with the moss. Now here I'm going in with my highlight. So even in these very small areas, because we're using the liner brush, we have an opportunity to deliver quite a lot of detail, and I think that it is turning out really, really wonderfully. Though I'm not going to apply this to all of the branches. Some of them simply will be too small, and I do want a lot of diversity. Now that our trees have some great base layers, we are going to go back to our palette, grab the filbert brush, and about an equal mixture of titanium white, Mars black, and our golden green. Then I'm going to add in some additional Mars black and really darken this. Right now we are essentially trying to create the darker base layer for a lot of the foliage, which is going to be draping off of all of those branches we just worked so hard to render. So there I am giving it a test. I can see that I really like the color, but I had more of a mid value than I did a dark value. So we work in some additional Mars black, start testing that, and then we have a color I really like. So we'll go back to our fan brush and start getting that on the canvas. Now I'm going to start applying this, as you can see, by working essentially along the edge of some of the ends of our branches, and then I start to branch out and I have some fun kind of moving more so in that downward direction so that it looks like all of those branches have smaller branches, which then have these little pieces of foliage that fall off. When we get a little bit farther back, you can see the separation in between all of the little tap marks that the fan brush is creating, and it's always different, it's always evolving. It's such a great way of applying paint for these sorts of subjects because you're getting so many different applications on the canvas so quickly, which is so wonderful, right? I mean, it's really expediting the process, and in the process making something just so original looking, so much really sharp detail. So I'm going in with that, being fairly cautious initially. Nothing is kind of overdone. I'm not adding just an absolutely massive amount of foliage to any one area where you are jumping around, and that way, again, if you added too much to any one particular area, then you kind of force yourself to either redo that area, meaning painting the background sky color and then painting the background tree colors and then perhaps the branches. Not what you want to do. Instead, we paint the smaller amounts and then we just slowly add to it once we feel like we have a smaller to reasonable amount in every area, and that way we can just kind of progressively work up to the amount of detail and thickness of foliage that we want. So here I'm now working more so at the bottom, and again, so nice to kind of have as much pigment to work with as we do. Had we done the initial mix of pigment with the fan brush, would have been really a process to get as much paint as we are currently working with, which is again why you generally want to do that mix with your filbert brush instead. Now here I am starting to work on the other side of the canvas before I do kind of start to fill out any one area or another, because this is going to have quite an impact. You can see that a lot of the foliage is going to be overlapping, much like the actual branches that we had earlier on, and this is a great opportunity to cover up any branches that you don't particularly love. I think that a lot of us we'll end up with some branches that are a little bit too thin, perhaps a little bit too transparent, or maybe you kind of accidentally applied slightly more pressure than you wanted towards the end of a branch. That is an area to really focus on and add significantly more foliage to. So where you add all of these little taps, it's going to change from person to person, painting to painting. As you can see with mine here, I do start more so in the middle, but I'm also going over the entirety of our set of trees. That way the foliage looks like it exists behind, in front, to the left and right of all of these subjects, and that's so important. You really don't want it to look like, in the end, the larger tree bodies all exist, directly in front of the foliage, because they themselves will produce branches and therefore foliage. So definitely something to consider. Here we are getting quite close to the top of the painting, and the branches on the right hand side, admittedly, they look kind of rough. You have more of that canvas texture than I'd want to see in them, and they were also quite thin. So we will go back up to that area eventually, but right now we are filling out more of the bottom, covering quite a bit of the actual trees themselves. And just picture the painting right now without all of the brown, all of the burnt umber that we incorporated in the trees. Remember, we also consider doing more of a green bark, which would be technically correct, which would, look quite good if the trees themselves weren't covered and surrounded by so much more green. But I think here, looking back, we made the right call by not doing much, if any, of the green bark. The moss and the foliage, I think, balances it quite well and certainly gives us more than enough. So here we are heading back up to that top area, kind of going over the thin branches, which again could have been rendered a little bit better. You can, of course, go back and thicken them, but you can also cover them up. Once we have that applied and drying, we can now head back to our palette and mix up a brighter variant of that green color. So here I am mixing it right beside our initial mixture. That way we can kind of compare and contrast. I do have, something that is quite a lot brighter going on the palette here, and we don't want it to be quite that bright. So I'll grab some extra Mars Black and, just desaturate it a little bit, but also move it down on that value spectrum. Here we are testing it, and I can tell that it is a bit more saturated than, kind of what we have on there, and also arguably a little bit brighter, though we are, able to kind of aid that with some additional Mars Black. The darker we make it, essentially, the more opportunity we give ourselves later on in the painting process to brighten it up with a third layer, a third highlight, to, again, add more of that really beautiful pop, right? So I do try to darken it a little bit more. Now we are heading into the actual foliage, and I'm essentially initially trying to apply this to the tops of the clusters which we've previously rendered, and then I move down slightly, but I'm much more sparing with the taps that I apply, so there are more openings and the bottom is for the most part darker. Again, we want to essentially outline the top with highlight without outlining the top, because you don't want to outline in acrylics, but you don't want the majority of it through this textured application to be brighter than the middle or the bottom, because the light is coming downwards as well as, again, from that center area. So that's really the goal right here. You can also see that occasionally I'm doing a little bit of a drag with my brush as well. It is a bit more sparing than it was initially with the background layers, and that's because generally the drag, in addition to the tap, can make things look a little bit more messy, and I was okay with that in the background because it was something that was going to be covered up. I didn't want all of this very sharp detail, because the background isn't meant to be this immaculate thing. The eyes can't pick up on detail naturally when it's really far away, right? So you need to make those kind of concessions in the actual painting as well. But now we're in the middle ground and we can pick up on that actual detail. So I'm trying to be a bit more aware, a bit more cognizant with my actual applications, and so I'm doing quite a bit more of an actual tap than I am a tap and drag, though it does occasionally happen, and I can show you how we will connect this a little bit later on without using that drag effect and the fan brush. But here, just working around the top areas and of course the sides that are going to be facing the light for the most part. So we have these general lighting rules and we're following it with each and every subject. Now we're going to head back to our palette, this time however with our smaller liner brush. We'll also grab some water, some titanium white, mix that into our previous green mixture, and start working on a brand new highlight for our foliage. this is going to be applied predominantly to the tops of our branches and the larger clusters of the foliage. Now here we do want to ensure that we start on the top in the areas that are facing the light, and then we work our way down. The actual application process is done through a series of taps and drags, and this is essentially how we are creating a lot of the form in the foliage. We talked about this earlier in terms of using the fan brush and the tap and drag effect to create a lot of that form versus using just the tap effect with the fan brush to create the texture. This is a great way of kind of connecting all of that texture from that fan brush, so you don't actually have to do that tap and drag effect, which can look a little messy with the fan brush. So again, different ways of going about things, though I do know that both techniques have worked quite well for different people. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate both throughout this painting, so you could figure out what you personally like to do and how you like to work. With that, I am now moving over to the left hand side of the canvas, again kind of trying to discern which of these kind of protrudes the most, what area is going to be receiving the most light, what is going to be the top of them. We do that tap and drag effect, and you can also tell that if you compare the branch on the right hand side to the branch on the left hand side, the hue changes a little bit. The one on the left is more saturated. It's a bit more of a greenish yellow because we didn't incorporate as much titanium white and Mars black. And I do think adding diversity like that is important. We are going to want to kind of splash around these greens so that things do still feel relatively cohesive. That means kind of jumping from tree to tree. Here you can see we're adding it back into the original one, then the one right atop it. So we are kind of going the distance with these pigments, but while kind of trying to still create some diversity, even if it is something just as subtle as hue or the slightest change in value. But so far I really like that. We're going to take a couple steps back here, just kind of give the painting a good look, and then I say, you know what, okay, I really like it down there. I think we can incorporate some on the top right hand side. Something I was initially hesitant to do because it is a bit farther back in this forest setting. It is hypothetically going to get slightly more shadows, but I did feel like this protrudes enough that it is going to catch quite a bit of light, and therefore we can render some real highlight. I'm not going to bring that highlight all the way over to the side of the canvas. It really is in the areas that I feel like this different cluster foliage can kind of peek out and capture more of that light. It also, again, just does make the painting feel much more full and much more natural. So I really like how that's all turning out right there, so much to the point where we do go over to the left-hand side and add more of that technique there as well. But it isn't done there. We do kind of work on some of the smaller areas, and it is important that you don't just do this with the larger ones. A lot of the more distant, smaller kind of clusters are going to receive even more light because they are, in such an area that isn't going to be receiving shadows. They are, if anything, going to be casting shadows on the ones that are closer to us. So they should definitely get some extra attention. Make sure they are nice and bright as well. And then once you have that, you can go back to the foreground and kind of continue to expand where you want. Again, following the same general idea of we'll add a little bit, we'll add a little bit, we'll add a little bit, and not kind of go overboard in one area or another. Take those breaks, really sit with it, make sure it's what we want it to be, and then continue to proceed from there. But so far so good. I really love how this is turning out. We've added so many layers, despite the fact that we still have a lot to do, but I really do think that it's paying off. And, spending a couple hours on just a singular portion of the painting can really make it so rewarding and make the painting a whole lot better. So do take your time and really enjoy the process. Now we can take a little bit of a break from the top of our painting and start working on the base layer for our grass, which is going to be a mid-value. So not the darkest pigment, not the brightest pigment, but something nice and in the middle. That means we're going to be using quite a bit of titanium white and Mars black. The green is also going to be worked in there because, of course, it is grass. We do want it to be green, but we also don't want it to be too saturated, because we're going to be applying 2 different colors on top of it, and we want to ensure that this one is essentially the least saturated of the 3. So here we're going to test that on our reference photo, and I can already tell that that is looking like a really nice mid value, though I do think we can play with it a little bit more. So I move that off to the side. We grab some extra Mars black, as you can see, mix that up quite well so we don't have some areas that are brighter or darker than the others, and we'll test that in the foreground. Now this is a color that we're going to transition into. So at the top of our grass we're going to have something that's a bit brighter and, you know, less stark, and then as you move closer to us we'll switch to the darker pigment which we rendered, and that way we'll have a nice gradient, because naturally the foreground, it's more saturated, but it also has more contrast because it has less atmospheric light kind of bouncing around, so you can see more of the natural colors in real life. So when you're painting a landscape and you want to incorporate some additional depth, really easy way of going about that is just ensuring that the foreground has a lot of, you know, sharper, more stark, saturated pigments. So here in the background, we are going in with a bit more of a muted green. It's not all that dark. We're just cutting our way around all of these different fallen logs that we have throughout the painting. And I do have quite a lot of paint on my brush, as you can probably tell. That is very intentional. I want a nice thick base layer for this. Of course, you could always go back in and do a second, a third layer with that same value, but I'm pretty confident that with 1 or 2 layers we can get the job done, provided we aren't kind of scraping the paint around. So here I am still just working my way around all of those different areas. We are using the filbert brush because it can carry quite a lot of paint, and we can also take this mid value and work it up some of these trees as well, because the pigment will actually be quite similar to the mid value of moss that we rendered before. So again, it'll work out really, really nicely. Here, admittedly, I accidentally do take out one of our fallen trees, though again, I'm never too concerned about kind of painting over a portion of my drawing. We do still have the traceable, the reference photo. We can always go back to the start of the video and just see where everything was drawn there as well. So a lot of different options for us to work with. But so far so good. I really do like how that's turning out. And we are now moving into the foreground, which means we can start making things a bit darker and creating more of that contrast. So I'm working on more of that mixture. We will start by blending this into the previous application. You can see that while it's darker, it's not significantly darker. We are still aiming for a relatively subtle transition. I'll start working that more into the middle area, and we'll just kind of blend that out a number of times until we get something that we feel progresses quite naturally. But with that, I'm quite happy, and we are heading back to our palette. So now we will kind of start mixing up a new spot here. We have our golden green, quite a lot of our Mars black going in there. We do have quite a bit of our titanium white. Again, none of this right now is meant to be too saturated, as it is just our initial layer, and I think this will work great for that background area. So we'll start painting right beside and well on top of the last application, because it might still be wet. We might still get a very clean blend, which would be nice, and you know, we can just kind of continue doing more of the same over here on the left. Still working our way slightly up the tree. I'm doing a little bit of a tap around the top of where that grass is going to be, doing a little bit of a sketch where my fallen tree is going to be, that way I don't accidentally cover it up like I did on the other side as well. So, you know, just making little markings, ensuring that we're moving in the right direction. Then as we get towards the bottom, we do grab significantly more Mars black, little bit of the green, a little bit of the titanium white, and this will be yet again our transitionary color and value into something that is significantly more stark. We're also now closer than ever before to us, so this is going to be slightly darker than what we have over on the right hand side of the canvas, and here we'll get nice and close. Though I would like to note that my brush is moving kind of downwards. You can see that the land has a real slant to it, and I'm trying to work in that general slant. That way, subconsciously, if you still see any of those brush strokes, it feels like a leading line, and your eye can kind of naturally move throughout the piece. Now the next step is quite fun. It was actually the cleaning day for our hamster's little habitat. So it was a bring your daughter to work day. This is a Timbit. She's pretty adorable, and I just thought I'd share her with you as we did spend the rest of the day kind of painting together. At this point, our grass should be fairly dry, so we're going to start working on some texture. Now, this textured layer, much like our very first textured layer, does need to be a little bit darker than our last application. So, we are working with a significantly more Mars black than we were before, and I test that on the reference photo. I can already tell that it is moving in the right direction. So, from there, we're going to just start changing things up. We'll add a little bit of titanium white to a side mixture, and that does look like it will work quite well in the foreground. Again, we're working with a couple of different variants of these dark pigments. That way we can ensure that we do have a good transition from the background, which is receiving more light, to the foreground, which can be quite a bit more stark. So I do start in the background here with a series of taps. Again, very similar to what we were doing initially with our background trees. We are rotating our brush in the air. We are trying to get a different little impression on the canvas each time. We are leaving room and space in between each of these taps. That way we do have that nice textured look. It is all of these little variations. We have these slight changes in value, and that's really what's going to make it look natural a little bit later on. So with that, as we start to move closer to us, I'm going to do a little bit of a drag, as you can see with my brush. And I'm doing this in multiple directions, but because the bristles on this are so distinct, when I do this, I'm actually create a series of little strokes, and they move in different directions as if they were, varying patches of grass. I think it makes things look quite interesting. For the most part, I do want these to kind of lean in towards the left-hand side of the canvas, just because we do want the leading lines moving towards the center of the piece, but I am doing quite a lot over to the right as well. As we get closer to us in the foreground, I'm also now making that mixture a little bit darker. We add in some additional titanium white, and here you can really see just the general pattern that we're creating here with these strokes and the normal effect that we want as you progressively get closer. So it does move from a pure tap in the background to a little bit of a stroke to the right or left in the middle, and then as you get to the foreground, it's quite a dominant stroke to the right or left with a darker pigment. Here we'll move over to the left-hand side of the painting and actually work in the opposite way. So starting closest to us this time, we have those very distinct strokes, and now as you move farther into the background, we are getting into that nice tapping effect, which I think is turning out really, really well. We are going to be incorporating grasses, little leaves, a lot of different subjects here in the foreground. So the layering process will be quite extensive, but I think we're definitely setting ourselves up for success with these right here. Again, you can go over these areas a number of times, but I do recommend kind of starting out a little bit more on the sparse side of things, and now we can go back in and start to fill it out just a little bit. And I think right now what we're getting is really the perfect mixture, the best application we really could have. So I like that a lot. We're also not going to miss this little spot here in the middle because, that is also going to show through. It's going to be fairly shadowed because we are going to have two trees around it, but for the most part, I think that looks quite good. Here we'll get a little bit farther back so that we can finish up this bottom area, and of course, because it is close to us, it is going to be much more comprised of longer strokes. The closer we get to us, the longer those strokes can be, the more prominent they can be, and I think that's turning out really quite nice. So now that we've completed our base layer and the darker texture layer, it's time to start working on our middle and bright values. So we are back to our palette, we have our filbert brush, and we are going to test what is initially far too dark of a pigment. So we go back to the drawing board, so to speak. We add in some additional titanium white, some of our added gold and green, and then I do feel it gets too bright, so I start working back in some Mars black. Right now, I don't want the brightest green possible. Again, I want that mid value, something brighter than what we've rendered before, but also something that we can make brighter later. and we go back to test that a couple of times. This time, however, I realized, you know what, it's a little bit too saturated. I want to desaturate it. We can do that with titanium white, so I start to mix that in. And when I test this, I realize, you know what, it is far from the middle value that I want, but it is exactly what I want for my highlighted value. So rather than continuing to mix with that right there, I take a little bit of it, I move it to the side, and then I start mixing the middle value elsewhere. That way I can go back to that brighter value in a little bit. And just like that, I did find the middle value I actually wanted. So now we are in a great position. From there, I do grab my fan brush because I do want to render a lot of implications with relative ease and a fairly random application. So we grab that middle value and we start in the background. It's worth noting that the orientation of our brush for the most part is going to be quite angled, and angled in the general direction of the land and how that's going to be moving. Here you can see that in action, and I do try to kind of discern which areas of land are going to be protruding the most out towards the middle of this larger kind of divot in the painting, because that area is going to catch more light than the rest. The light is going to hit the edge, and then we're going to get more shadow as we move towards the back and towards the right-hand side of the painting. So I kind of initially create these protruding areas, and then I move farther back, I move down, I let that paint dissipate. Our brush, it gets these less opaque applications the more you apply. So we do get this nice gradient from bright to dark with those protruding areas. Then I am going back to the farthest area here, and I do start to fill that out initially. Then I move forward and I fill out some of our other areas as well. This is going to be quite a bit of a process, and all of this right now is essentially little leaves, ones that are kind of sprouting from the ground, kind of protruding, and we're going to have a very wide collection of subjects here on the ground. We'll have a couple little flowers in some areas, we'll have some grass, we'll have quite a lot going on, but this is definitely a great place to start. And as you can see, we do slowly go back, add more layers, continue to fill things up, and I actually decide to make the background essentially almost like a flat wall of the pigment. And then as you move forward, there's more separation between the applications. That way there's more contrast, and it just makes it look like that back area is kind of consumed by light. There's a lot of reflective light in that area, which makes a lot more sense because it's more open and there's less shadows from the trees. Then I do go to a slightly brighter color, and we just kind of brighten up those edges. From there, we will move over here to the left-hand side and continue doing the same. This is going to catch quite a lot of light. It's really kind of moving to the center, and that means more light can get to it. But as we move farther back here, I'm being a little bit more soft with my brush. I'm letting that paint just kind of run out subtly, and we're creating something that I think looks quite nice. So far, so good with this general application. As you move into the foreground, I'm going to start pressing slightly harder with my brush to render a little bit of a larger application. That isn't quite apparent yet, but it will be soon. And the whole idea there is that the little individual leaves are going to be larger visually in the foreground because you are closer to them. Perspective is going to make them look larger, and that's really important. Here you can see I'm really starting to incorporate those larger applications. I'm tapping the brush onto the canvas, and then I'm applying pressure. I'm not moving the brush, I'm not creating a stroke, but I am kind of building up on that foundation. Then we go to our highlight pigment, which we accidentally mixed to. I go around the top areas of all of this foliage, and we just start to work on that highlight. As you can see, being fairly careful, being fairly subtle, have the light kind of stream in between those two trees there. I think that looks really, really nice. It's a subtle effect, but I think that subconsciously it adds a lot to the painting. And here you can see that we're also just about ready to start moving on into the foreground with more of that highlight. Again, applying quite a bit of pressure to get something that's of a relatively decent size. And now you can see that through the variety of 4 layers at this point, that we are starting to build some depth and something that really can capture quite a bit of interest. So from there, we are going to switch to our smaller round pointed brush. This is a liner brush, and this is going to be fantastic for our grass. Really, the smaller the brush, the better in this scenario. I am going to be working with the greens we previously mixed up, and as you can see, with a very wet small brush, we're going to render the smallest blades of grass. Now, admittedly, this does take some time. It takes quite a lot of time, but the smaller the markings you can make, at least initially, the better this is going to look. These are very far away, so these little pieces of grass are going to be incredibly subtle. Here you can also see what it looks like from a bit of an afar. Again, very easy to get really close and just add all of this detail and then realize it's too much. So do try to look at the painting from a bit of a distance, especially as you're just starting. That way you can really gauge and make sure that you have what you want going on. There, admittedly, that piece of grass was a little bit larger than I wanted, so I kind of paused for a second. I said, okay, you know what, how do we want to move forward with this? So I grabbed some more water, and then we kind of continued to progress into the foreground here. And as we move into the foreground, we do apply slightly more pressure. We can use slightly more paint. We don't need as much water because we do want the grass to become a bit more opaque. We want it to be a bit larger because perspective-wise, that makes sense. It is getting closer to us, and therefore we see it and we recognize it as something that is visually larger. So the grass here isn't actually any larger than the grass in the background, but it definitely needs to be painted larger to have it be, you know, looking as natural as possible. So that's what we're doing there. You'll also notice that while a lot of it kind of moves in towards the center of the painting to help with our leading lines, not all of it does. It's really a balancing act, and here you can see I'm actually moving some kind of pointing towards the right. That way we do have that diversity, and I'm also creating clusters as well as kind of creating individual strands. So there's a lot going on, despite the fact that we are just creating, you know, a plethora of lines here essentially, but they all have their twists, they all have their turns, they all have different heights, and sometimes they'll be overlapping one another or overlapping another cluster entirely. The goal here, though, is to not fully cover all of our shadow area. We don't want this to become overbearing. We don't want to kind of actually take away detail by taking away all of the shadow, right? So much like everything else, work on this with a very sparing attitude. Start with a little bit, add a little bit, take a couple steps back, add a little bit more, take a couple more steps back, and just kind of continue playing with it in that way. And eventually you'll end up with something that I think you really like and really appreciate. Here I do go back over a couple areas, and we are getting closer, so I am okay with, you know, applying a bit more pressure with that brush. Though if you do ever feel like you do have to apply pressure with the brush, recognize that you probably just need more water on your brush and a little bit more paint as well. There I applied a marking that I didn't really love, so I tried to kind of move that off with my finger. Didn't work all that well, so then I added a lot of water to my brush, and then I went back and I just kind of moved that off. So another thing I wanted to do with this lesson, and I try to do with a lot of them, is not necessarily just show you exactly how to do everything perfectly, but also show you when I kind of mess up a mix or when I make an application that I don't love and kind of how I go about remedying that, because I think that is equally as important. Because even when you've been painting for, you know, 10, 15 years, things like that do still happen, and that is a-okay. Knowing how to fix them is just a good part of the process. So yeah, hopefully you enjoy seeing when I make silly little mistakes like that and how I remedy them there. Again, it was just, while it was still wet, getting a lot of water on my brush, applying that water to the canvas, and then wiping off that whole application with my finger. Big fan of finger painting. Always have been, always will be. I think that it's a very useful tool. But with that, we are now moving over to the left-hand side to add some additional grass. Again, portions of this done in real time, other portions done sped up, because painting all of these pieces of grass individually does take quite a bit of time. And here, I think I actually overdo this area. I think that I add more than I want to, but we will go back to that later. And here I also wanted to show you how I'm rendering some grass with a fan brush to create just a lot of different strokes all at once. I didn't want to do this in the background because I wasn't confident in the fan brush's ability to render a lot of very small markings, but I felt like I could take that chance here in the foreground, and I think that it actually works really, really nicely. So here, grabbing some additional water, going back in and creating those elongated applications that, wow, yeah, that worked really, really wonderfully. That said, we are now fairly deep into the painting, and as per usual, I would like to take a little bit of time to say thank you for being here. Thank you for watching the lesson, having fun with me. I think that it's just always wonderful to see people excited about art, spending time really diving into the lesson. So if you made it this far, of course, congratulations. And I also wanted to say a big thank you, of course, to everybody who is supporting the channel directly up over on Patreon. It is because of you that I was able to make this incredibly detailed lesson and all of the other ones, that we were able to break them down into steps and take the time to really make something of quality, right? So again, thank you. I know I say this every week, but I make an effort to say it every week, and I feel like I'll never say it enough. I wouldn't be able to do this without you. This channel is predominantly fan funded by all of you up over on Patreon, and it is because of your support and your generosity that these things actually happen. So thank you for supporting the channel. Of course, you can get the traceables and the reference photos for this up over on Patreon to kind of, say thank you and to kind of aid you in the painting process, the color matching process, the drawing process. Up there, you can also find my ebooks, our exclusive Facebook group. There's a lot, so check it out if you're interested. But with that, on to the next step. So jumping into the next step here, we are going to start with quite a bit of titanium white, a little bit of our green gold, and the smallest hint of Mars black here, because right now we are mixing up the brighter layer for our grass. I'm doing so on top of our previous layer. That way I can tell that we don't kind of drift too far and that it is in fact brighter than our past rendition. Though whenever you do this, I do highly implore you to leave a little bit of that initial mixture just off to the side. So if you feel like you're kind of going off and you lost the vision, the goal, you can still see exactly what that is and kind of get right back on track. But with that, we actually did quite quickly find exactly what we were looking for, and so I am heading in to the foreground of the painting and applying our first strokes of the truly highlighted grass. Now, I'm doing this with a very wet brush because I do want some elongated strokes, as you can see here. That does mean we might have to do a couple of layers, but at this point we're working with such a small brush with such a little pressure, I'm not too concerned about any of that. And the grass that I'm initially focusing on is the clusters that we've previously rendered with the middle value. That I like their positioning, I like the movements. I start with those and then I kind of branch out in different directions. Though I am still trying to be very aware of the open spaces and retain quite a lot of them, because it's that contrast between that very dark base layer and these new very bright kind of blades of grass that's going to render us something that looks really clean and give that nice pop in the foreground. So at this point, I'm taking a couple of steps back from the painting. We are starting to interject those highlights, and I realize, before we kind of get too far with that, I want to make sure that everything works cohesively. And when I stepped back, I realized that this little area to the back left was a little more complicated than what I wanted. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I liked it better without all of those blades of grass. I felt like we lost the contrast in there, and I also wanted more just visual diversity, pattern diversity amongst all of these different grassy areas. So with this, I decided, you know what? We're just going to cover it up with that darker base layer that we started with, and we will rebuild. This time, however, we are going to be using the fan brush pretty much exclusively. I really liked that tapping effect, that foliage, all of those little sprouted little leaves. That effect, I think, worked really, really well, and that's definitely something that we're going to reincorporate back into this. But it's one of those things that I love to bring up because acrylic paints are such a versatile medium. They are such a forgiving medium. You can mess something up terribly bad, and then wait 10 minutes, let it dry, and jump right back into it, fix it. It's so easy to cover it back up and just go again. It's one of the reasons I love this medium. I'm definitely someone who likes to iterate on my work, try things, get very creative, get very experimental, and then find what I really like and really craft that. Acrylics are great for that because they let you try things. You wait 10 minutes and then you can just try again. So wonderful. It's what we were doing here, and I definitely like having this area a bit more visually simple, and having the right and left side here, while cohesive in color, a little bit more interesting. So with that, we are now going to start working on a lot of the fallen trees. As you can see, we are going to be using quite a lot of Mars Black, quite a lot of Burnt Umber, a little bit of Titanium White. We are working on the base layer, so we do want it to be quite dark, and we will test that in the background. And look at that. We got so lucky with that mixture, really the first try there. So I'm working on my farthest spot right here because it's the smallest. I want to approach it when I have a fairly damp brush, when I have a good amount of paint, when I can really ensure that I'm rendering those nice sharp lines. That's exactly what we do. We of course start on the edges, so the top and the bottom, then we kind of fill in the middle as we, kind of worry that might be running out of paint because we don't want that kind of chalky, toothy look on the edges. That said, as we do kind of continue to move through the painting and get to some of these larger tree trunks, these fallen trees, I think it's quite evident just how thin this pigment is. You can really see a lot of the white canvas showing through, and that is a really good indicator that we are going to have to go back and do multiple layers. Now, when you're doing multiple layers, generally you end up expanding sides and edges a little bit, so do make sure that even in these early layers that you're being fairly cognizant of the size of these fallen trees and you're not making them too wide. We want to cover all of that, titanium white that we can see from the canvas, but we don't want to make it too extended. Also, while I'm going about this, it'll look a little bit awkward because we are going to have to cover up some of the grass, which is actually in front of these logs. Like you can see right here, it kind of looks like they're getting cut off and it doesn't really make sense. And that is just part of the process. Once our fallen trees here are fully rendered, we will go back, we'll add grass on top of them, and it'll make it look significantly better. The depth will make a lot more sense, and we will get there. It's just going to be a little bit of a process, but with acrylic painting, while you have a very forgiving medium, you also have something that requires a lot of layering, and I think that it is very evident through this section of the painting here. But we are just starting quite simply by putting on a fairly thin application for the beginning of it, and I know a lot of you are probably going to probably wonder, well, why don't you just go back and add that second layer to it immediately? It's a lot easier to do multiple layers once your pigments have started to dry. Otherwise, you might just end up moving around a lot of paint, and if you have to apply any pressure, you'll kind of push that paint off of an area and really reveal the canvas underneath. So going back and letting it dry for a little bit does generally make your kind of endeavors there significantly easier. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're just letting those dry and we're moving forward in the painting. As you can see though, it has started to dry and I'm just going back and doing little tests here and there. Now, at this point, we are still doing just the base layer. And that is going to look fairly barren, at least initially. Again, I guess this whole section is quite focused on layering, but we will talk a lot about how to make these look nice and three-dimensional, nice and textured, how we're going to add moss on top of them, highlights, little flowers. They are going to be built up in a similar way to how we did our trees initially. I'd say how we did our grass, but we still have quite a bit to do with that as well. So again, more so just kind of trusting the process and moving forward with this. with confidence. But here I'd also like to note that we are going to spend a lot of time talking about how the light wraps around these subjects. We were just talking about the Patreon and how everybody is up there supporting it. If you are up there and you do have the ebook Acrylics for Beginners, there is a section in there on wrapping light around subject, both a very strong light and a very soft light. So if you have a very misty scene, you're going to want to look at the portion kind of on soft light. If you have just a very bright day, you kind of focus on the hard light and just how much light wraps around that subject, how you make these kind of cylindrical shapes three-dimensional. Would recommend checking that out if you do have access to them. And again, for everybody who is perhaps new to the channel, up over on Patreon, you can get my ebook Acrylics for Beginners, which includes essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting. In it, we talk about how to work with three-dimensional subjects, what brushes to use, how much water to use, how to mix your colors to render different colors. Really everything you need to know, again, just glazing, all of it. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. There are also a bunch of ebooks full of traceables for those uninspired days where you know you want to create something but you're not totally sure what you want to create. Again, just a bunch of rewards for those of you who do decide to support the channel directly. But if you don't have that opportunity, it's totally okay. Don't worry about it. I'm just happy you're here working on the lesson with us today. Alright, so moving into step number 25, we are going to start building some depth, and as you can see, we have a brand new color on our palette, that being some burnt sienna. Now, I love it because it's earthy, but it's also warm. It's bright, it's saturated, it's a very thin pigment, but it can do a lot. So we're working with it in conjunction with the burnt umber, the titanium white, the Mars black, and we're rendering something that's quite a bit brighter than our previous application. Here you can see that I'm testing it on our actual tree, and I do like it, but I do think it's quite a bit dark. It's quite a bit desaturated. I want to work on something that's a bit brighter that we can then layer on top. So here we go back in, we test, and that looks really, really nice. So I like those two pigments right there. We're going to go back in for one more test, and I do think, you know what? Let's add a little bit more saturation back into that, and with that we have exactly what we want. So we'll start with the darker of the two mixes, though it is still brighter than the highlight, and we'll start applying that on top of our, cylindrical-esque trees. This is happening because the light is working its way through the center, through the middle. It's going to brighten the top, and then as we start to move towards the back and the bottom, the light can't hit that area directly, right? So instead, the back is essentially just lit through reflective light, which is going to be significantly less strong, and therefore we are going to end up with something that continuously dissipates. Then, when you kind of find yourself at the bottom of these logs, we do try to leave that as dark as we can, because, of course, then you just have the shadow of the ground and the actual log kind of together. So that is something we are continuously working towards, and I do want to mix up the pigment a couple of times here. That way we do, we don't have to kind of grind what we have into the canvas. Again, the more pigment you have, the better off you're going to be, and it's also nice when you kind of mix up pigment a number of times, because the more you do so, the more you retain that information, and that's just going to make your future attempts even better. So here we are continuing to do more of that application around the top. We are doing multiple layers, and I'm being very careful. You can tell that my brush right here is quite big in relation to a lot of these, so I'm trying to go in with as little pressure as I possibly can, and the more layers that we add, the brighter it ends up looking, because the acrylics are semi-transparent. You can see that darker layer underneath, but the more we add to it, again, the more of an actual gradient we get. I am trying to leave in lots of my strokes as well. That way we have some nice little movements in the actual wood, but so far so good. Now it's time to add some texture, and we'll do so with the 1/2" flat-headed brush. Again, this one has some pretty stiff bristles, which is great because it means it'll make a lot of different markings on our canvas. And again, we don't want to wet this brush before we jump into this, because we want those bristles to stay as far apart from each other as they can. With that, we are following the general rule of building light, building depth on our cylindrical subjects. We are adding these highlights to the tops of these trees predominantly to begin with, and then as we start to run out of paint, we do start to move towards the middle and even the back. We're also going to continuously go back to our palette, grab more paint, because we really don't want to have to apply a lot of pressure. If we do that, we'll probably end up expanding the bristles and creating markings that don't look as sharp and as fine as they currently do. And that's very much the goal with this layer. We just want a little bit of texture. We want a little bit of additional detail as we continue to wrap light around these subjects. Though this isn't the final layer of our highlight, we are definitely going to do a lot more with it. So don't worry about that, and don't go in with the brightest brown you can mix. Recognize that this is still a part of a stepping stone, right? And here we're also doing a little bit of a tap just to get some texture. Don't do too much of this. This is really just meant to be an added little embellishment, but I love it. So now we are going to dive into the next level of highlights, and we are back to our palette, mixing right beside our last highlighted pigment, because again, that's really the best way of ensuring that you are moving in the right direction. Here I am using more burnt sienna than we previously did, and looking at that, I think that we are getting really close, though I do think it could be just a little bit brighter. So we add in some additional titanium white. It's also worth noting that we are doing the mix there with the filbert brush, and now we are switching to the smaller liner brush. We are going to go over the tops of all of these with that liner brush, and I'm doing so with a litany of small, tap and drag effects, very similar to what we did with our bark. However, I am going to allow these to be a bit more detailed. Sometimes they're moving in and out of one another, and I'm going to do that because it's closer to us in the foreground. We can see more details because it is where it is, and that means we need to get a little bit more playful with it, at least in the first 3 or 4 of the following trees. Here, we're in the background. This is fairly far away. We're not going to see that same level of detail. So you could see more elongated strokes, and we don't kind of have everything interweaving like we do in the current piece that we're working on right here. I do also recommend painting quite a bit of this from a little bit of a distance. It is easy to overdo this part of the process. I think that initially when you start doing it, you'll be like, wow, this looks fantastic. I love the way it pops. And because of that, we have to be careful with it and ensure that we are being, pretty mindful with our general application. Here I'm moving on to an even bigger one, which I think is quite fun. You'll notice that the highlight doesn't go all the way to the back of the left-hand side, and that's because the trees on the left-hand side are going to cast a little bit of a shadow down onto that area, as is the land, where this middle piece is pretty much not obstructed by any of the foliage or branches. So that's why the middle area here is a little bit more bright, though every area of it does follow that same general rule of how the light is wrapping around. So consider that area that is closest to the middle more of a hard light. So we're getting more light wrapping around it. It is much more prominent. And then as you move towards the left-hand side of that one, it's more of a soft light. It's less of a direct light. So we're not getting the same level of bright highlights, and we're also not going to see as much detail either, because generally the light is what's going to show us and reveal significantly more detail. So when you have a soft light on a subject rather than a hard light, you need to also change the way you paint it, not just the individual values as well. This one's pretty interesting right down below because it'll have a little bit of a shadow from the one that's right in front of it. And so again, just consider the different subjects that are kind of in range of the ones you're painting, as everything will cast a shadow, have an effect, maybe even reflect a color. All very interesting things to consider when you're working on a painting, especially when it has so many subjects just like this one. While a lot of them are similar, they interact with each other in different ways, and I think that's what makes scenes like this and scenery just so captivating, right? And here I just wanted to do a bit of a wide shot, show you how far we've come, and to let you know that we still have a lot to do, and this is going to look really, really nice. So now that we have a lot of that applied, while we aren't completely done with the wood, it's time to start embellishing it with some moss in a similar way to how we added the moss to the tree trunks earlier in the lesson. So we're starting with a fairly dark green, as you can see. Then I do go ahead and start mixing more of a bright highlight for it as well. Sometimes you're going to want to mix, one and then mix the other later. Sometimes you want to do them simultaneously. That way you know before you jump into it that they're both actually going to work. And with that, I switch over to the fan brush because again, it's just so efficient at rendering these very randomized but organic looking applications. So I do work it kind of in the middle, in the bottom area, as that is a spot that's going to get a bit more wet. And then we also work some up onto the top area as well. I'd also like to note, I am purposefully avoiding some larger portions of the top because I do want to retain that really nice bright brown pigment that we rendered. So while there is going to be green up there, I don't want it to be really overwhelming. We have a lot of green in this canvas. We don't have that much brown. So I am going to be fairly tactful despite the fact that we're using a brush which can yield some random kind of applications, though again, we can still do it in a relatively controlled manner, and that's exactly what we're doing. I'm also kind of just working tree to tree here, not applying the dark color and then the highlight and then working to the next tree. I am kind of dancing between all of them with this darker pigment to begin with. That way I know I have the correct amounts, and then I'll have a better idea of how much highlight I want on each, right? So here we are just kind of moving from tree to tree. I kind of go back, I add secondary layers to some of them just to thicken it up a little bit. You really don't want a lot of the green to look semi-transparent. You definitely want some areas to look nice and full. So do ensure that you are going back, especially once you've given them a little bit of time to dry, which will honestly range depending upon your kind of location geographically. So do consider that. I know I generally say like 5 to 10 minutes, but for some of you it might be 2, for others it might be like 20. Just that's something that comes with time, and you will recognize the more you paint. Though, here we are now at the point where we can start working with some of our highlights, or more realistically, midtones. These aren't going to be the brightest of the brights. We haven't started to incorporate those yet here in the bottom of the painting. This is something that's brighter than our previous application, but not all that bright either. We still have room to play. The same goes for the highlights on the wood, actually. We are going to kind of heighten those as we continue to kind of progressively add more of a movement, more of a highlight, more depth onto these trees, right? So many things all at once just by adding up these values and kind of building through the lesson. But here, yet again, we have a little bit of a wider look so you can kind of take it in, see what it's meant to look like. And next we are going to have some fun with some detail work. So now we have the general base layer applied for a lot of those fallen trees. We have a lot to add to them, but at this point I feel comfortable layering some grass back over top because, as you recall, we did have to paint them on top of some grass, and it didn't really make sense to have the grass just stop as soon as the tree visually ended up where it did. So here we mix up a really nice bright grass, and we can start moving that on top of the wood. I'm trying to apply this fairly randomly, as you can kind of note. It isn't meant to be overwhelming. I'm not adding a massive amount of these, just enough to show that the grass does overlap a lot of this, and it's going to start to tie it all together, make it look a whole lot more natural. You can find the previous pieces of grass that did get cut off. If they are particularly bright, then you can kind of work off those, but don't feel like you have to kind of go over all of them because some of them will actually be under the wood and you don't want to kind of overdo that certain area. But I am even doing this very far in the distance, though as we get farther and farther into the distance, those applications certainly got smaller and smaller. Now, I do mix a little bit of our cadmium yellow deep hue into our paint for the first time in this lesson to diversify it, to give us a little bit more of a warm green, say the warm lights moving in on there. So here I start to work on our moss. I do begin on the place that is closest to where the light is going to be hitting. I do a lot of that edge work with the tap and drag effect, similar to how we do the highlights on our wood, and then I work my way backwards with a series of randomized taps and the liner brush. You really want to use the liner brush for this process because this is the detail work we've been waiting to incorporate. This is what we've been building up to, and this is where we can really make the painting something special. So make sure that this is a process that you are willing and ready to take your time with. If you feel like you've been painting for like 8-9 hours at this point, maybe this is a part where you kind of take a little bit of a break, you refresh, you have some water, you have something to eat, you come back into it excited, because this is something that you don't want to just get done. This is something you want to embrace and really spend some time thinking about and working through. So here what I'm doing is, again, more of the same, but I'm jumping around a lot with it. We are adding different amounts of green, yellow, and titanium white so that it's quite diverse. I do want some of it to be fairly watery, so semi-transparent, so I get these really neat, almost muddy mixtures. And then sometimes I want it to be very opaque, like what you can see right here, and you can't see any of the green or other colors through it. We are going in and, trying to define edges but not make it overwhelming. Again, I do want a lot of that actual wood to show through, but I do also really want this beautiful warm green to have a real presence in the painting. I do think that it's allowing it to stand out from the grass in a very meaningful way, and that's something that we were definitely working to achieve. So yeah, definitely take your time with this and do play around with a lot of those colors. Here, again, we have a bit of a wider shot. It is getting a little bit late, so we have some warm light coming into the room. It's kind of changing how the painting looks, but that's important to consider because the lighting in your room is going to differ. So from there, we are going to take a little bit of a break, and we will be back to that in a little bit. Though right now, I do want to create a dark base layer for where our small river is going to be in the painting. And I'm testing this in the darkest crevices of the painting. The river isn't all that prevalent in the reference photo. You can see like a little bit of water in that center area. I'm personally going to make mine much more visually notable. So I start off in that center area. As you can see, this is the darkest pigment we've worked with, and it's very close to the dark pigment on the bottom of the wood right here in the foreground. It's just a little bit more so, and it does have a little bit of green in it as well. While it is the base layer for our water, we're going to have a lot of green reflecting down into the water. So I do want it to feel cohesive, and I do want it to mesh with the rest of the painting, which is why, while it is a dark pigment, it does still have that, kind of green tint to it. And here we are cutting along the edges of these trees, trying to ensure that they are nice and sharp, trying to ensure that this application is nice and thick, and then we'll also start moving it over into the right as well. But in this process, do ensure that you're not kind of just dragging paint around, creating something that looks a little bit rough. And when you get towards these edges, do try to move it into the grass through a series of taps and strokes. You should be able to get a fairly decent looking gradient into that, and we will add grass to overlap it later. It'll look a lot better, it'll make more sense, but for now you can create a little bit of that gradient just to kind of mentally ease into it and be like, all right, this will look okay. When I paint, I do that sometimes. I add things that I know aren't going to stay in the end, but I know they're going to make me feel better about the painting in the moment, which is kind of funny. But yeah, don't feel like you need to shy away from that sort of thing. Here I'm also extending the river, the little bit of water, the stream rather, into the distance, and I'm also tapping it up into the left and right hand side. I also decide that I want some additional logs here on the left hand side. So while I really liked that grass, I am covering that up with a bit of a silhouette. Generally, you want a silhouette in your painting because the eye innately goes to the brightest point in any piece, and by making the top right, top left, bottom right, bottom left hand corners a little bit darker, you just subconsciously move the eye towards the center of the piece. So you can see right down here that we do have this quite dark pigment on the bottom right and bottom left, and here I'm actually crafting the silhouettes for some rocks which are going to be layered on top of this log that we have right here, just to kind of break up the motions and make it a bit more diverse. So jumping back into it here, we are going to grab about an equal mixture of our golden green, Mars black, and titanium white. This is going to render a fairly dark green, which we will use for the texture on all of our mossy rocks. Then after that, I do start to mix a bit of a brighter variant, taking that same color we had, interjecting some extra titanium white, cadmium yellow deep hue, and we are using that cadmium yellow because, again, I do want to warm things up and differentiate a number of our greens because we don't want it to get too visually samey. That said, looking over to our reference photo, I think it's worth noting that at this point we have started to move in a different visual direction with a number of the subjects. We have a lot more grass in our piece. I think it's a lot more clean looking, and all of that is intentional. I looked at the reference photo, and while I love it, I didn't feel like it was a place I could really walk in and explore. And something I always try to do with my landscapes, my scenery, is create a scene that you feel you could enter and really just enjoy moving through. So do feel like you can take those artistic liberties and have fun with it. I certainly do, and I did with this painting. Here, however, you can see a close-up of us applying our moss to the rocks for the first time. We are going in with that same tapping effect we normally use for all of the textured shadows. This time, however, we're actually going in with a slightly brighter color, and I'm trying to apply a very minimal amount of pressure here. I do want little openings so we can see that darker base layer showing through, and at this point, the edges aren't going to be all that sharp or defined. You can still see the drawing that I've done here with some additional conte, and that is a-okay. We are going to go back in, we are going to define those edges. Right now, the process is really just about building up that texture and getting something that looks fairly neat, again, quite diverse. It's not really a look or aesthetic that we have established down at the bottom of the painting. So while we're using very similar colors, we're using different textures, and that is going to help us differentiate with our subjects. We also, again, are going to be working in with more of that cadmium yellow deep hue, which will also help us differentiate. So there are a number of different things you can do in this area. So when you're working with one color or just a couple of colors, recognize that you really can do a lot if you kind of just get creative with it, as we are attempting to do right here. So again, we're kind of taking a step back, we're looking at it from afar, touching up different areas, but so far so good. Now it's time to jump back into the painting with our smaller liner brush. We're going to be using the highlighted pigment that we mixed a little bit earlier, and we're going to be using this to craft our edges for the most part. However, we're not going to be painting direct lines for those edges because, again, we want to avoid outlines in general. So I'll be going in with a tapping motion and just trying to get the general movements of the rock. Later on, we can just get rid of that conte with a little bit of water, so it's really not a concern if we don't kind of move over those edges perfectly, but I am trying to get something that is much more defined, and I think with the rock we're currently working on, that is much more apparent. Though I'm also moving some of those highlights down a little bit to show that there are also multiple levels to the rock and the moss, which I think makes it a whole lot more interesting. It gives you an opportunity to create all of these different anomalies rather, all of these different levels. And again, I think that's really fun. So here we also have that yellow worked in. It's making the green slightly different. And then when I find an area that I do feel is fairly in the light, we go back and we do start to take out some of the pieces in between that were shadows, because there are going to be areas where it doesn't dip down, where you don't get those darker pigments, and that's really what we are trying to work with here. So with that, I am now just kind of moving more towards us in the painting. I did like to start kind of in the back, because that's when you have the most amount of paint on your brush, on your palette, when your brush is the most damp, so you really have the best opportunity to render the smallest of applications, and that's where you really need to do that in the back, right? Because you don't have as much room to play. As you move farther into the foreground, then you can get a little bit more lax with that, because the subjects themselves are a bit bigger. And here we are speeding things up because I was at this for quite some time, but I do think that all of these many applications do build up into something that really does look quite nice. Though I do think it's worth noting that we are now going to take some of those colors and we'll start working in some grass, because we wanted the grass on top of all of our logs, right? And now we need to ensure that it's on top of them yet again, but also on top of some of these rocks. Here I'm also using a bit more yellow to kind of make things a bit more cohesive, but also diversify, which I know it sounds like it's a contradictory statement, but you are kind of trying to do both in different areas with different subjects, right? So do always kind of keep that in mind and have fun with it as well. Here we had quite a bit of an opening, so I figured I would fill that. And you'll also notice that all of the grass is still different lengths, that the widths do change, that some of them are a little bit sharper than others, and I do think that's important. I did notice over on the left-hand side that we could actually do a little bit more, so I also started touching that up. Now we are going to move on to the next very fun step, and for this I did clean my filbert brush. We are grabbing quite a lot of titanium white, and for the first time some ultramarine blue. Actually, it's not the first time. We used a little bit of it in the sky, and we're going to create a very, very similar color here. We have the smallest hint of Mars black. We're going to re-interject additional titanium white, but the goal here is essentially to create a good reflection color for that sky. So I'm testing it in the very small areas on the reference photo that we can see water, and then with my liner brush I'm going to start working around the base of a lot of our subjects, then just kind of work on some water that's moving out. This is all of the water that's kind of catching a little bit of that light. It's getting that nice shine, that nice reflection, and of course it is going to trail along the edges here. Now I'm going to show you this through a series of close-up shots, but also farther away shots. Because it's as bright as it is, it can kind of become visually overwhelming, and we want to ensure that that doesn't happen. So we are going to take a lot of steps back through this process and just ensure that it's progressing nicely. I also started to combine a number of those semi-horizontal applications in the middle where you'll really get that reflection, and I think that acts as a really nice leading line. It keeps it to be a very solid subject while being a very fluid subject, right? And it's relatively easily discernible because of that. So once I have those edges worked in, I go and strengthen the center a little bit, and I think that that's already off to a really nice start. If I were to advise one thing, it's to avoid a pure titanium white for the reflections in water. It's something that we all do initially. This again has a bit of blue in it, it has a bit of Mars black in it, and it arguably could have had a little bit more. Water is almost always slightly darker than the sky, and therefore the reflections are as well. When water is moving, you kind of have an effect that can contradict that. So I felt comfortable with this application, especially because it matched the reference photo quite well and it was technically correct. But I think that you could go with a bit of a darker mix here and end up with something that's really, really nice in a subtle way. Again, neither option is right or wrong. It's art, it is creative, it is subjective, and I welcome you to have fun with it. But just so you know, you can make it a little bit darker. Here I, again, try to wrap these around a lot of the logs, and then I kind of follow the general movements. So these aren't all horizontal lines. A lot of them are kind of warping slightly around the subjects to the left and right, or the rocks that are, directly in the middle. So there's a lot of fun to be had with this, and it is going to move really around how you craft the rest of your painting. So you are more than welcome to follow me here in how I'm doing this exactly, but also recognize that if you change where your rocks are or where some of your logs are, you're probably going to want to change this as well, just so things are always wrapping around one another and the motions feel really organic. That's definitely the goal here. Now with that, here we are looking at it from a bit of an afar. I'm going back, I'm adding very soft, small details. My brush is incredibly wet so that I can get the smallest details possible. And here we actually have the widest shot all painting. You can see that I'm listening to some music while we paint here. That's something I definitely love to do. So with that, I think I'm really happy with the water as a whole, and we're ready to move on to the next step. So now we're going to go back to that foreground. We're going to look at the moss, we're going to look at the bark, and we're going to start balancing all of it. Because when we started to work in all of the highlights from the reflective water, we kind of changed the way the light was balanced in the painting. And now when the eye looks at it, it really focuses on the water. I want to bring the attention back into a lot of the moss, into a lot of the fallen trees. And so we're going in with this mixture of burnt sienna, titanium white, maybe a little bit of burnt umber, and we're going to brighten this up. We're going to give it a slightly more saturation than what it previously had, and we're going to create something that can visually stand with all of the highlighted water that we worked in. Though recognize, I did note that we could go in with a bit of a darker water, and if we did that, then we wouldn't have to make this as bright as we are. So again, it goes back to the idea of not making anything too bright initially, not making anything too heavily contrasted initially or too detailed, because you can slowly add it, and if you do a little bit too much, then you force yourself to either redo it or make other subjects kind of comparable, and that's what we're doing here. I did end up liking the water, which is why I didn't mind going over all of this again with a brighter pigment, but recognize that those two things definitely do correlate. And here we are going over a number of these spots a couple of times because, acrylic paints are semi-transparent, and I really do like how this is starting to build up. Though, for the most part, I'm applying it more so in the middle and in the fallen trees in the middle of the painting, because again, the areas to the left and the right hand side are going to be receiving a lot more shadow from foliage, and we do want to keep that a bit more subtle. I'm also allowing the bottom of that one fallen tree there to be a little bit brighter, but it's not much brighter because it's going to get a shadow from the log that's directly right in front of it. So again, consider where your other subjects are in relation, and that'll also have a pretty good effect on the painting. Here we are going to grab some of our golden green, a lot of our titanium white, some of that cadmium yellow deep hue, and we're going to create the brightest green that we have so far for a moss, and we're going to now balance this with the new bark and the water, because at this point the bark and the water are much brighter values than the moss or any greenery really. So we need to ensure that that does kind of move up to that same level, which is exactly what we're doing here. The application process, very similar to what we've done previously, so you should feel warmed up. You should feel fairly confident in this part of the process. We are, going in with a lot of tap and drag effects. We're also doing a couple just little tap effects as we do for our moss in general. So by kind of diversifying that application, we ensure that it doesn't look the exact same application wise as the bark that we've been working on, right, which is also a tap and drag. So just that additional tap for the moss can make a big difference. We are working with some rather different colors, but I think that it makes a big difference when we can also, incorporate different textures and application styles to really diversify these areas. I'm also going to take a little bit of this and, as you can see, work it into some of the mossy rocks. This is the highlight that is streaming through the middle. It is special, and it is going to be applied to a number of different subjects, but very selectively, especially right around here. I really don't want to move any kind of farther right to that side of the canvas. But so far, so good. We're going to take a little bit of a step back, make sure that it's going well. You can also see that I'm bracing my pinky finger on my easel and on my canvas quite a lot. That is to eliminate shake from my hand when I'm working on these very delicate areas of the painting. But here we have another farther shot. Still quite a bit to do, but it's going wonderfully. So we did just take a look at this whole scene, and I do think that while it is coming along quite well, it's time to start diversifying our color palette and our subjects. So here I'm grabbing about 50% Mars Black, 50% Cadmium Yellow Deep Hue, some Titanium White, the smallest amount of Mars Black, and from here we're going to render some new subjects which will aesthetically match that of bulrushes. So there is a larger top piece, and then there is a very thin strand that kind of links them to the ground. This is really nice because it's a bit more of a warm yellow than what we've worked with before, as we didn't work any green into it, and it's going to brighten up the area a little bit. It's going to make the pre-existing yellows feel cohesive while also working a brand new one into it. And I'm also going to go over these applications for the most part a couple of times. You can see that I'll occasionally skip one just so it does end up looking a little bit darker and, just add some diversity to the piece. But I go in with a bit of a pressured stroke so that I get that larger top, that larger application. And then as I start to move downwards, I relieve pressure. That way we can get something a bit more subtle. Here I'm also applying some that kind of move on top of others, kind of intertwine, create that additional depth. We don't want it to look so clean and pristine that it just doesn't make sense. So again, do try to ensure that you do have enough diversity and even some overlap as well. I know that initially it might, in theory, sound a little messy, but if you are aware beforehand of where you're going to put that subject and you think about it, there are different arrangements you can make to have it all fit together and look quite nice. Here we have one that's kind of moving up right beside the water, which I think is pretty neat, and then we are moving them into the background. But as we get farther into the background, of course, we need to make them smaller and smaller. There I did start to really run out of pigment, which isn't a bad thing at all. As you can see, it just kind of made it look darker, more so in the shadows in the background, so I did like that as well. Now we're adding a bit of additional titanium white to it, maybe a little bit of extra cadmium yellow, and here we're building some highlight, which again, I'm not applying to all of them. We're being fairly selective, and we're just trying to build this up slowly. However, at this point, we've only done this to the left-hand side of the canvas, which you are actually more than welcome to do if you feel like that's what you aesthetically want out of the piece, but I do want the sides to match pretty well, so we are going to move over onto the right-hand side fairly shortly after, we're done with a couple of these touch-ups. I'm, as you can see, just continuously expanding. It's one of those processes that is admittedly a little tough to stop. There's so many opportunities, and I think so many of them do end up looking really, really nice. So I do continuously add them, though. I do recommend that, you do a fair number on that side, then you come over to this side, you do a fair number here, and then you go back and you add more. That way you don't kind of accidentally add too much to one side and you have to add too much to the other side, and then all of a sudden, you have to do a larger area all over again. So yeah, we're just going to kind of take it slow, or at least attempt to. I'm layering this on top of our rocks, on top of our grass, on top of our fallen trees, really just about everything. These are going to be the highest subject here in the foreground, so they are going to overlap all of our other subjects, and again, just make it all fit together, which I really like. Now it's time to go in with that highlighted titanium white and just kind of work that on predominantly to the left-hand side of these, because again, that light is coming from the center. It is, kind of applied on the right-hand side over on the left-hand side of the canvas because of where the light is. So jumping back into it here, we are going to be working with a very clean brush, some ultramarine blue, about an equal mixture of a titanium white, and then again about an equal mixture of Mars black as well. Here we are attempting to render a relatively rich but dark blue, and this is going to be the base layer for some flowers which will scatter throughout the foreground. Again, we are looking to diversify, and I think the blue will complement the blues in the sky and the reflection quite well. So with that, once I have something that I'm quite happy with, I do start to move down, and right now I'm actually going to put this flower onto one of these larger fallen trees, then we'll put it onto another one. I'm trying to ensure that I have them, for the most part, at least initially, closer to the center of the painting. That way it draws the eye in. You kind of can bounce around from these nice colors without kind of being led off. So that is the initial goal. Then once I have them in places that I feel like are going to be quite notable, I'll add some to the side, like the smaller cluster of 3 that we have right there. Much like all of our other subjects, clusters are a good idea, especially if you're going to be working with quite a number of them. But once I have those base layers in there, I do get some additional titanium white, ultramarine blue. We work on a brighter variant, and now I'm going to start applying some of the highlights to initially the tops of the flowers, but also the sides that are facing the light. Now, these are going to be quite small because they aren't that close to us. They're relatively close, but not to the point where we'll see that much detail. So I am essentially being a little bit more loose. It's almost like it's impressionistic, despite the fact that nothing else in the painting is. And it's not actually going to look impressionistic. It's just more so the way we paint it, right? Because it is a bit smaller and we're not going to see those same details. Then I do mix in some additional titanium white. We apply that again to the tops and the sides that are going to be receiving the most light, and I think that this was a really nice addition. It wasn't overbearing, it didn't kind of command too much attention, but I think it accented the other blues quite well and definitely made the foreground significantly more interesting. So with that, we are now moving into the final step. It is our last applications. This is always such a really rewarding part of the process. You do get to see everything come together, and I think a lot of us really feel like our paintings do come together in that final like 10 to 15%. So really enjoy this process, have fun with it, and appreciate your work. You've been working on this for a really long time. I'm sure you've been working hard on it. You've been applying all of these different layers and applications. So this is a great point, or rather a great time, to appreciate what you've done and, just bring it home, bring it to fruition, right? So with that, for me, I am working on one of the fallen trees over to the far left-hand side. I do want to keep it fairly dark because it is in the corner. I do want that vignette effect. But again, this area, this portion of the painting is going to be different for all of us. And at this point, I would like to say, again, thank you for being here. This has been so much fun. I really hope you feel like you've learned something. I really hope you feel like you've enjoyed the painting process. I do put a lot of work into, breaking these down into the steps and making something that you can really latch on to. So I hope that you did exactly that. And actually, fun fact, I think like only 8% of the viewers generally make it to this endpoint. So I generally like to give you you a little keyword which you can use in the comments should you want to. It's a little badge of honor to know that you did make it to the end, that you are one of the very dedicated few. And oh, what word do we want to go with here today? I think draping is a nice one. I like to go with unconventional words, things that, you know, you wouldn't normally use. And I look at this painting, I see all of the draping foliage, all of the draping branches, how some of the bulrush-like shaped subjects are kind of draping down. And I just feel like that's a fairly interesting and unique word for this. So in the comments, you can write the word draping, or you can kind of interject it into a sentence. Really up to you, but it's just a fun way to keep track of who is kind of making it to the end of these. But with that, I love how this turned out. I really do feel like it's probably, from a technical perspective, one of the best lessons we've done here on the channel. I really feel confident about how we layered, about all of our textures, about how we balanced it. I'm a big fan. So I hope again that you also found yourself in that place with this painting. Here I'm just going back and I'm adding some additional highlights more so to the center of the painting. But with that, yet again, we said it earlier, but we'll say it again and again and again. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to everybody who is up on Patreon directly supporting the channel, making lessons like these happen. Remember, if you are new to the channel, you can get things like the traceable, the reference photo. You can get all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, all of the books with traceables. You can get access to our exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share our work, and it's all quite similar, so it's a good place to kind of learn from one another. It's a very positive community, and there's a lot to check out there. So if you would like to, you know, just support the channel or get any of that, you're more than welcome to. There's a link in the description. But even if you don't, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community and making these paintings and these experiences just so special. I love that I have the opportunity and the privilege to teach for a living and to talk about art with all of you. So thank you for being here and really just making this happen. I hope that you will continue to tune in for our future lessons. I do intend to continue to, you know, work on similar pieces like this with a lot of foliage, but also diversify and just have a lot of fun with it. But with that, that is the conclusion of the lesson. So thank you for being here. You have a wonderful day. You have a wonderful evening. Stay creative, and I will see you soon.